Balding and bespectacled, McNally was not an obvious boyfriend. She called him the Toad. But he was fun, generous, charming, wise, and rich. She admitted, Patty was my father figure, 22 years older than me. It was, however, a volatile relationship, and McNally, who had a roving eye, did not always treat her well, teasing her about her weight, openly sleeping with other women, and constantly undermining her confidence. A guest at the chalet remembers Patty bringing a girl back one night and offering Ferguson the option of the spare room, or a threesome. Ferguson once confessed, Patty used to tell me I was fat and ugly, and no one was interested in me. And I believed him. She was keen to settle down, admitting I desperately wanted to marry him, though I never dared to broach the subject, even as he kept saying, I must do the decent thing. Deep down I knew he didn't really want to get married. We were at such different times in our lives, but I was afraid to let the relationship go, to be on my own. Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is Cheer Denise. We're going to keep going today in Entitled. This is the book about Prince Andrew and his ex-wife Sarah Ferguson. Yesterday in our readings, we learned that Andrew had become quite a spoiled brat. He was never told no. Nobody ever tried to discipline him. Pretty much what he wanted is what he got. Part of that was because of where he was in the birth order of the kids. Anne and Charles had been born first, and then about 12 years later, here comes little Andrew. And Andrew was raised as an only child for a while because his older siblings were away at school and his younger brother Edward hadn't been born. But he also had, I suppose you could call it the benefit, of a mother who now was more accustomed to her role as queen. And so she wasn't trying to learn the role of queen and be a mother at the same time. And so she knew how to manage, I suppose, being the mother a little better. But it would seem that she spent very little of her time trying to help shape and mold Andrew's character, and more time just went into doting on him and enjoying, I think, the role of motherhood. But it feels like because he had nannies and things, those individuals were entrusted with the care of his character, and she sort of got to play what one might think of as more of a grandmotherly role, because it was more just having fun with him, but very little telling him what to do, how to do it, at least from a morally building up character. And I'm sure he got plenty of instruction on what to do about royal protocol, but as far as how do you be a good man, how do you get along with others so they don't find you a repugnant pig? Nobody bothered to tell him about that. So yesterday was replete with stories about people saying that he was a very difficult person to get along with. Staff, teachers, his peers at school. Nobody really liked him. He also had this sort of tug going on in his spirit where he resented the fact that being a prince made him sort of in a bubble. But at the same time, he would lean on his title as a means of making himself feel better, to build himself up. Well, I am a prince after all. But then that would make people even more annoyed with him. So he was kind of always self-sabotaging himself with this constant talk about how he was a prince. And as a result, he didn't have very many close friends. He also isn't very good at school. When it comes to the academics, he struggled considerably, but he was athletic and he did shine in those areas. And while he might not have been the brains of the operation, perhaps his good looks and burgeoning charm might be an asset to them, is sort of the way they thought about it. Now, we also learned about Sarah. Sarah had a very unhappy childhood. Her parents were enormously unhappy. Her father was constantly cheating on her mother. And the womanizing was making Susan, Sarah's mother, very unhappy. But she was having affairs of her own. One with Prince Philip, which is pretty surprising. She was a very beautiful person, so I'm sure she had her pick of the lot. But after falling in with one of her husband's polo player friends, she ends up moving to Argentina and all but abandoning her original family. It's a really sad story of Sarah ending up being very lonely and feeling very unloved. Her older sister, who she might have gone to rely on, moved to Australia to get married at the tender age of 16, and her dad didn't know how to cope with her. So she turned to food, and she turned to being sort of the clown. And she had a very complex coping mechanism, and the way that she got people to not abandon her was by being an amusing sort of person that you wouldn't want to abandon. She was funny, she was jovial, she was easy to be around, and so it was this constant desire to people please so they wouldn't leave her. And her story was, I think, particularly sad. People seemed to see her eagerness And they also really liked to be around her. She, too, wasn't very good at school, but was also really excellent at sports and at, physical accomplishments. So she and Andrew are similar in that sense. While Andrew never really had a lot of friends at school, he did enjoy other people, and he really did enjoy socializing and entertainment. So perhaps that aspect of their personalities will draw them together. We shall see. It's going to be a minute before they find each other. Now, where we left off yesterday, the family has realized that Andrew's not going to be the brains of the operation. That's okay. They have plans for him. And we left off yesterday with this sentence. Andrew would rather have spent his time having a good time than his studies, or in thinking of the future. But away from school, plans had already been made. It was now that his royal duties began. And so we start on this section entitled The One with the Robert Redford Looks. In July that year, it had been decided that Andrew should undertake his first foreign tour, attending the Montreal Olympics, where Princess Anne was representing Great Britain in the 3-day eventing. Though he was only 16, with his easy manner and handsome appearance, his older brother Charles only half-jokingly described Andrew as the one with the Robert Redford looks, the trip was a great success. One Canadian newspaper described him as 6 feet of sex appeal, boosting his already strong confidence. The young prince had even then begun to assume the role of useful poster boy for the monarchy. 6 months later, traveling as Andrew Cambridge, he started a 2-term exchange visit at Lakefield College, a Canadian school of 240 pupils, modeled on Gordonston lines, with a strong ethos of community service and outdoor activity. The boys camped 1 night a week. According to protocol, the pupils were told to call him Andrew, the staff Prince Andrew, the governors Sir, and the chairman of the governors His Royal Highness. But to the boys he soon became Andy, or Randy Andy. Lakefield, founded in 1879, is one of Canada's oldest private schools and occupied 315 acres on the shore of Katchawanooka Lake. Just as Prince Charles had spent time in school in Australia, the 6-month exchange was intended to cement the monarchy's connection with the country against rising republicanism, in this case from French Canadians. It was also an opportunity for Andrew to reinvent himself. He threw himself into school activities, from ice hockey and skiing to appearing in several plays, including as Mr. Brownlow in Oliver. He also conducted a teenage romance with Sandy Jones, whom he had first met at the Montreal Olympics, and began spending nearly every weekend with her. She recalled, in a way, he quite resented being a prince. He hated the fact that he was marked out for attention, that he could never be on his own. The fact that his royal bodyguard always followed him around got on top of him. For Jones, it was an important relationship. Interviewed shortly before Andrew's wedding, which she attended, she said the 2 of them had been in love. Were we lovers? Use your imagination. We were very, very close. As close as any couple can ever be. I still love him. I'd marry him tomorrow if he asked me. The Canadian Olympic figure skater Lynn Nightingale sat next to the prince at a dinner in Rideau Hall, the Governor-General's residence. He was absolutely charming, quick to laugh and smile, she recalled. He seemed very ordinary, relaxed and warm, a perfect gentleman. Andrew spent the spring vacation skiing with the Canadian Prime Minister, Pierre Trudeau, and his children, Sasha, Justin, and Michelle, then sightseeing in Toronto for a few days, and finally staying at the farm of his roommate, Peter Loriman, in Ontario, helping tap the syrup from the property's maple trees. He ended his time in Canada by joining a Lakefield party consisting of the headmaster, another master, and 4 other boys for a 10-day, 300-mile trip by canoe down the Coppermine River to the Arctic Ocean, camping and catching fish. The experience would stay with him and see Andrew retain close links with the school. Andrew later served as a Lakefield trustee and honorary chair of its charitable foundation until 2019, and 5 times joined former classmates for a union canoe trip in the Northwest Territories. It does sound exciting. Well, meanwhile, what's Sarah up to? This section is entitled First Steps. Meanwhile, Sarah was one of the 200 girls learning typing, shorthand, bookkeeping, and cooking at Queen's Secretarial College in South Kensington. One of her closest friends at the time, Charlotte Eden, the daughter of a former Tory MP, remembered them sitting at the back of the class and giggling. But they knew it was important to get some sort of training. At the end of the 9-month course, Fergie graduated joint bottom with Eden, having a shorthand of 90 words a minute and typing speed of 39. Her report read, "Bright, bouncy redhead. She's a bit slapdash, but she has initiative and personality which she will use to her advantage when she gets older. accepts responsibility happily. That summer of 1977, Ferguson stayed with her school friend Claire Steele in Nantucket before visiting Australia for a month with her father to see Jane and her husband Alex Maycomb. The Maycombs ran an 8,000-acre farm of cattle, sheep, and cereals, Wilga-Warrena at North Star, on the border of Queensland and New South Wales. They lived in an L-shaped wooden house with leaking tin roof surrounded by flat, scrubby brush where summer temperatures regularly hit 100 degrees. Sarah loved it. On her return, she started temping at Flatmates Unlimited, a flat-sharing agency on the old Brompton Road, whose boss, Wendy Keith, found her bubbly, helpful, good with people. Through her father, she quickly secured a job at Durden Smith Communications in Knightsbridge, a PR firm led by Neil Durden Smith, whose clients included BMW, Trusthouse Forte, Guinness, Mappin and Webb. Here she incurred the wrath of Peter Conrad, who was also responsible for organizing the annual Berkeley Square Ball by spending a great deal of time on the phone dealing with her social life, fixing up dinners and nights out, he remembered. But she was also reliable and thrived on responsibility. Durden Smith was equally complimentary. If I had a naughty problem or a difficult client, I would always bring Sarah in, he said. She had that priceless asset of being able to get on with all sorts of people. I saw in her something which a more qualified girl didn't have, and I think it was sheer personality. When we had parties for clients, she was always the person who whizzed around all the different rooms introducing people to other people. It didn't matter whether they were 70 or 27. She was just a natural at it. See, and that's what I think everyone liked about her at the beginning. She was just a natural person. She wasn't overly cultivated, and I think part of that was her coping mechanism. She could have gone one way or the other. She was in a group of people, all of them elites. Her family had run with the royals since her birth. She could have been as standoffish as she wanted. It's not as though they pulled her up out of a gutter and married her off to a prince. She was not some nobody. So she could have been an overly polished person because that lifestyle would have been afforded to her. She could have figured out how to be that person. But she chose to be the sort of person that cultivates an almost overly relatable vibe, because she's going to be the person that's going to say what everyone's thinking and get buy-in from people that way. Now, what's going on with her future husband? Let's see what's going on with him at Gordonston. In the summer of 1977, Andrew went back to Gordonston, where he was joined by Prince Edward. Georgina Houseman thought he returned more thoughtful, much more considerate and responsible. One slightly younger female contemporary has very different memories, describing him as a very slimy so-and-so, arrogant, pleased with himself, a bully. She remembers as a 13-year-old camping one November in the grounds of Balmoral, and Andrew, then 18, ripping off the fly sheets and throwing them into the river for fun. She adds, he thinks he's funny, handsome, and clever, and he isn't. Nobody cared for him, though some sixth form girls hung around with him. He swaggered round, but all the cool boys of his age thought he was a tosser. It's a view shared by another Gordonston contemporary who survived the pervasive bullying at the school by running a protective racket supplying porn magazines, cigarettes, and alcohol, which he kept in the crypt at St. Michael's Kirk. Andrew, he said, felt entitled and took himself very seriously. The young prince had his groupies and lots of girls around him, but it wasn't clear how many people, if any, he really trusted. Andrew would throw his weight around and literally often say, "You do know who I am." Fellow students detected a degree of narcissism. He was so full of himself. People were wary of him. The prince had earned his nickname Randy Andy, thanks to his ever-changing circle of female conquests. His harem would include a champion swimmer, Sue Bernard, Cleo Nathaniels, who came from the Bahamas and mysteriously left the school early, and Christy Richmond, whose mother was a school nurse, who stayed at Sandringham over New Year and was included in a Balmoral house party one summer. Perhaps the most important relationship in his final year at Gordonston was a long-distance one with an American from a well-known family who was studying her A-levels in London. They wrote to each other often and spoke on the phone, and she remembered his sense of mischief. Yet he could be guarded. He always had this concerned look when out. Then he always drank ginger ale. He introduced her to Diana at the palace and let her swim there, borrowing Princess Anne's costume. He was good at including Diana, who was often lonely and bored in the very early days before her wedding. The Americans sensed that he was naive and mistrusted people in case they took advantage of him. Security was very important to him. He was kind, generous, and trusting of me, and it was a great responsibility to be discreet. Andrew took her to Heatherdown, but revealed mixed feelings about Gordonston. The relationship came to an end when she started art school in September 1980. The prince was keen to continue, but she had moved on. While Charles' career had been planned out for him, Andrew, as the second son, was much freer to follow his own interests, much to the envy of his older brother. Clare College, Cambridge, had been mooted as a possible next stage, but Andrew was neither sufficiently intelligent nor intellectually curious enough to make that a serious option. His interests lay elsewhere. At Gordonston, he joined and was eventually put in charge of the Air Training Corps, learning to glide at 15 and earning his wings 3 years later after a parachute course at RAF Brize Norton. He had decided to join the Navy in order to fly. Over 3 days in December 1978, he undertook a series of interviews and tests at the Officer and Aircrew Selection Center at RAF Biggin Hill, and with the Admiralty Interview Board to assess his suitability for a Navy career. The following spring holiday, he attended the Royal Naval College for pilot training. That summer, after passing 3 A-levels in history, English, and economic and political studies, he was told he had been accepted into the Navy. He had not been guardian at Gordonston. That honor went to a woman for the first time, Georgina Houseman, much to Andrew's annoyance. But he had been head of house and chosen to crew the school's 63-foot yacht Sea Spirit. He had also played cricket for the first 11 for 3 years, captaining it his final year, and for the hockey first team and the squash and tennis teams. Many of his expectations had been fulfilled. Andrew remained in touch with the school and later in life with the director of Gordonston Schools between 1992 and 1999. A former housemaster recalled him returning one day to visit his old boarding house. The teacher was intrigued because he had heard little about Andrew's time at Gordonston, which was hardly ever mentioned, whereas there were many stories about Prince Charles' days at the school. All I had heard about Andrew was that he was a bully. He took the prince to his old room on the top floor. "The smell's the same. The smell. I'll always remember the smell," was all Andrew said. The housemaster and the Duke stood together in Andrew's old room, but there was no reminiscing from the Duke, or even an acknowledgment of his companion. He dismissed me, as of no account, and I was not expecting this, recalled the housemaster. I said a few things which he chose to ignore. I wondered why he came at all. There was not a single pleasantry or word of thanks. It was as if he remembered no person or incident, just a smell. This is very telling of him dismissing the person who has brought him there as of no account. We're going to see this as part of his personality. People who cannot help him, who cannot give him a leg up, who do not have anything he wants, are next to nothing in his mind. He's going to treat staff this way. He's going to treat underlings this way. If you can't help him, he really doesn't have time for you. This section is entitled Dartmouth. In September 1979, Andrew, who had signed up for a 12-year commission as a seaman officer, sub-specializing as a pilot, started at Dartmouth Naval College in Devon for 7 months of general training, following in his father and older brother's footsteps. This would be followed by 10 months of elementary flying tuition with the aim of being qualified to fly helicopters after 2 years, and fixed-wing aircraft after 2.5 years. He had still not managed to win the affection or respect of his colleagues. The wife of one of the instructors recalled, "Prince Charles is still remembered with tremendous affection. But Andrew isn't popular with either the staff or his fellow cadets. His brother is a great, practical joker, but Andrew walks away from anything like that. He never lets you forget who he is." Ian Hendry was 6 weeks ahead of Andrew at Dartmouth, and they became friends, helped by shared car journeys back to London, and that Hendry treated him as a fellow professional. Andrew later became godfather to one of Hendry's children, never missing a birthday and always giving thoughtful gifts. Hendry found him a bit remote and thought he compensated for shyness by being over-ebullient. He was born in the wrong age and would have been happier as an Edwardian gentleman. He puts on his royal hat to protect himself. That's his veneer. Hendry cast him as a slightly lonely figure who didn't really know how to make friends. He was confused how to behave as he moved between the naval and royal world. Barriers were put up as a coping mechanism, and he became bombastic. Another cadet who served with the prince and twice got lifts to London in his police escort got to know Andrew because he was such a loner, but also found him a strange mix of someone who did not appear to feel relaxed about his position as prince. Andrew was not naturally good at making friends. He would relax and then stiffen up. He wasn't a person with whom one could get close. At the beginning of 1980, still only 19, and having recently been made a commander of the Royal Victorian Order, Andrew joined the aircraft carrier HMS Hermes to gain some seagoing experience. In March, as the final part of his Dartmouth training, he was attached to the Royal Marine Training Wing and took a shortened version of their all-arms commando course. It involved a 30-mile route march, 12-mile hike with full pack, 9-mile speed march, sleeping rough, and 6-mile endurance course ending at a rifle range where he had to fire 10 rounds within a certain grouping, for which he would earn the coveted Green Beret. A training officer claimed, "We've put him through hell and he's come through smiling," with Commandant Colonel Leslie Hudson saying, "There's no doubt that with a little more training, the Prince would be an extremely good commando officer. He has all the right qualities." Many Marines, however, objected to Andrew receiving the Green Beret without doing the full course. But it felt useful to have a friend at court should the Marines need one. At the beginning of April, together with 300 other officer cadets, Andrew passed out in front of his mother. But his instruction continued with a month's aircrew survival training at the Royal Naval Safety Equipment School near Gosport, learning first aid, aviation medicine, and the use of survival equipment. This included a 10-day stint in the New Forest, with only a parachute for shelter, replicating the experience of being shot down behind enemy lines. He learned how to kill, skin, and cook a rabbit, live off the wild, and escape, evasion, and survival skills. A fellow midshipman recalled, "Andrew was spared nothing. He had to do everything that we did. And he proved himself to be quite tough. It was as though he had something to prove, that he could do anything just as well as the next man." From there, it was on to a 5-month course of fixed-wing flying training within the Royal Naval Elementary Flying Training Squadron, based at RAF Leaming in Yorkshire, a management course for junior officers at HMS Excellent in Portsmouth, then one on firefighting, nuclear, biological, and chemical defense. In November, he moved to the Royal Naval Air Station at Culdrose in Cornwall, learning to fly the Gazelle helicopter, causing one of his co-workers to complain that he was a bit toffee-nosed and didn't behave like everyone else. "He wants his own way, and when he's around, you have to bow and scrape. Even when he drives around the base in his car, you have to salute that. I mean, fancy saluting a flipping car." Ewan McNair served with the Prince around the time and got to know him playing squash. McNair remembered him as being unworldly and sheltered, someone who didn't know much, and who seemed to get on better with his police protective officer than his naval colleagues. He wasn't used to dealing with normal people, didn't drink, and didn't trust people because he had been let down in the past. Everyone treated him with benign indifference, neither shunned nor sucked up to, said McNair. They used his name to get into nightclubs, but for Andrew it was a solitary life. One of the problems was that Andrew found it difficult to make the switch from royal to naval officer. He often put his prince hat on, especially when he wanted to get his own way. He didn't shine during training in fixed-wing bulldog, and he didn't get on with his instructor, said Ian Hendry. But at Culdrose, he came into his own as a helicopter pilot under an instructor who gave him confidence. This was reflected in his personal relations. But Andrew helped uniquely by having his own personal instructor, showed that when he made an effort, he could be among the best. On his passing out parade in April 1981, he was awarded the prize for the course's best pilot by his father. On February 19th that year, the prince had celebrated his 21st birthday by being made a Counselor of State, something he accepted as his birthright. This was followed in June by a party shared by the Prince Philip's 60th for 600 guests at Windsor Castle, transformed with the aid of potted palm trees into a tropical paradise. Guests included Lady Diana Spencer, Margaret Thatcher, and several of Andrew's former girlfriends, including Carolyn Seward, Gemma Curry, and her cousin Kim Dees, and actress and model Trisha Money. Also, there was the daughter of Charles' polo manager, Sarah Ferguson. Andrew's love life had begun to attract the attention of the media, though the extent of the romances was never entirely clear. It did no harm for the career ambitions of a model or an actress to be associated with the Queen's son. Andrew had met the 19-year-old Carolyn Seward, then Miss UK and a former runner-up to the Miss Universe contest, and in 1983 to appear in the Bond film Octopussy, while he was at Dartmouth. He had invited her to dinner at Buckingham Palace where, she later revealed, all they did was listen to music and explore the roof, though there were reports of her having left the palace early one morning. Curry's father, an RAF wing commander, had given Andrew flying lessons, and she had accompanied him to events at RAF Leaming and to Princess Margaret's 50th birthday at the Ritz in November 1980. The prince had then taken up with her cousin, Kim Dees, a model then living with her boyfriend in St. John's Wood, who spoke highly of him. People think that because he's so good looking, he's not a nice person, but he's extremely sensitive and kind. He certainly doesn't live up to his nickname of Randy Andy at all. He's simply a good friend. What is this good looking business, you guys? I don't get it. I'll look for some pictures that might prove me wrong. Less than a week later, Charles announced his engagement to Lady Diana Spencer, and in July 1981 they were married in St. Paul's Cathedral, with Andrew, as well as Edward, one of Charles' two supporters. Sitting in the front row with some of Diana's flatmates was Sarah Ferguson. Okay, well, Sarah's been making some appearances in Andrew's world, but the truth is she's been making appearances in his world since the beginning. You'll recall that Sarah's parents often hosted the Queen and Prince Philip at their house, back when they were still together. So, for her to have been included in these royal circles, it's not even a situation worth an asterisk. It's just what would have been. She would have been invited to these things. But it is not immediately clear if Andrew had noticed her yet. It seems that he was too busy with other women. So let's figure out what they're going to do about him as far as who's he planning on settling down with. It took Charles a minute to figure out who he was going to settle down with, and I wouldn't exactly call that settling down. So what are we going to do about Andrew? In the autumn of 1980, Durden Smith Communications had been sold, so Sarah Ferguson and Charlotte Eden traveled to South America, where Hector Barrantes had bought a 1,000-acre plot of land, El Pucara, and began to be regarded as one of the best breeders of polo ponies in Argentina. The two young women stayed until Christmas before exploring South and North America by bus. At Squaw Valley in Nevada, they cleaned dormitories at a youth hostel and in the evening waited tables at an apple strudel shop. I did not know that. Sometimes the things you find out that these elite people were doing with their time, it's always surprising. Even like when Diana was working at that nursery and sort of like living in an apartment with several friends, it all seems so normal. It's just weird that these people could have normal lives, even things adjacent to normal lives. But to be traveling south in North America by a bus and working in a strudel shop and cleaning dormitories is so very normal, I just can hardly believe it. On her return, Sarah rented a 2-bedroomed apartment in Prince of Wales Drive overlooking Battersea Park, belonging to bloodstock dealer Angus Gold. She supported herself with a series of part-time jobs, at a video company arranging shoots and dealing with clients until it went bust, with Durden Smith now running a company called Sports Sponsorship International, with her friend Julia Dodd Noble, who had set up Noble Housekeeping, which provided office services, with an estate agent, and finally for art dealer William Drummond, who recalled she was a super saleswoman with that knack of remembering clients and their tastes and sporting what might please them. She was in a relationship with Kim Smith Bingham, 2 years older than her, having met him when he was working at as a ranch hand on her mother's ranch after leaving Eton. He brought me into a new social set, and I loved him very much, she remembered. But he was also full of teasing, which I would feign to chuckle off, though I'd be injured to the quick. She was later to admit that at this time she was not an easy person with whom to have a relationship. I was trying too hard. I understood no limits, no boundaries between the me and the you. I would inundate people with my neediness, suffocate them really. No reasonable man could stand it, and so he would run away or chase after someone with more self-respect. I set myself up for rejection and got permanently hurt and stunted. When Smith Bingham, one of the top 50 downhillers in Britain, moved to Verbier to run a ski-wear shop, she followed him. It was there she was to meet one of the most influential men in her life. Among Smith Bingham's circle in Verbier was Paddy McNally, a former racing driver and journalist on the magazine Autosport and later racing manager to Niki Lauda. His wife Anne, from whom he had separated, had died of cancer in 1980, and he was bringing up their teenage sons, Sean and Rollo, alone. McNally owned an 8-bedroom chalet, more commonly known as the Castle, with a London property developer, David Elias. Along with a local night spot, the Farm Club, it was the scene of legendary parties frequented by a fast crowd, who included the art dealer Nigel the Rat Politzer, the businessman John Bentley, who was dating Sarah's childhood friend Lulu Blacker, and the Marquis of Blandford. Balding and bespectacled, McNally was not an obvious boyfriend. She called him the Toad. But he was fun. Generous, charming, wise, and rich. She admitted, Paddy was my father figure, 22 years older than me, adding, he taught me so much about life. Whenever I wanted advice, I turned to him because he was so worldly wise. He seemed to have seen and done everything. It was, however, a volatile relationship, and McNally, who had a roving eye, did not always treat her well, teasing her about her weight, openly sleeping with other women, and constantly undermining her confidence. On one occasion, she dumped a bucket of ice water over his head after he flirted with an especially attractive visitor. A guest at the chalet remembers Patty bringing a girl back one night and offering Ferguson the option of the spare room, or a threesome. The audacity. And my heart is just going out to Sarah because her neediness is so relatable. The pain and youth of having parents who just kind of cast you off. You end up just being such a needy person in relationships. You end up giving so much of yourself. You end up letting your respectability be trodden on because you just so desperately want to be seen, to be loved, and to be chosen. And you'll do anything to get the person to choose you. And my heart just goes out to her that she would put up with this, but I understand why she did. Sarah put up with it because, as one girlfriend said, quite frankly, she was besotted with him, and there was nothing that one could say or do to make her see reason. She adored Patty, but he didn't treat her well, remarked another friend. Ferguson once confessed, "Patty used to tell me I was fat and ugly, and no one was interested in me." And I believed him. She was keen to settle down, admitting I desperately wanted to marry him, though I never dared to broach the subject, even as he kept saying, "I must do the decent thing." Deep down, I knew he didn't really want to get married. We were at such different times in our lives, but I was afraid to let the relationship go, to be on my own. Isn't that crushing that he would call her fat and ugly and tell her no one's interested in you? So that she wouldn't leave, so he'd always have just like a warm body in the bed, when he couldn't find that third person. What a jackass. All right, well, what's going on with Prince Andrew? This section is entitled His Royal Heartthrob. In September 1981, Andrew was commissioned as a sub-lieutenant and the following month joined the frontline 820 Naval Air Squadron based on the aircraft carrier HMS Invincible as a pilot on one of his 9 Sea King helicopters. Little did he know that within months he would be at war. On April 2, 1982, the Argentinian leader, General Galtieri, invaded the British sovereign territory of the Falkland Islands. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher vowed that they would be retaken, and on April 5th, Invincible sailed to the South Atlantic as part of a task force of 40 ships, with the Queen adamant that her son should be treated no differently from any other serviceman. "I will order Prince Andrew into battle just as I would any of my other pilots. He's a co-pilot, and with the others he gets the same work to do, and he gets no quarter from his fellows." 820 Squadron's commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Ralph Wykes Snade, stressed, "I have found him a capable young man and competent in the air. He has been with the squadron a year, 7 months on operational duty, and of course he is very special to the public. You are conscious of that fact, but he gets no special treatment here, and I am under no instructions from above to treat him any differently from any other under my command." As a Sea King co-pilot, Andrew, known in the Navy as H, after HRH, was expected to engage in anti-submarine warfare using passive sonobuoys or active sonar lowered into the water to protect the task force. The helicopters could also attack the torpedoes and depth charges, conduct surface surveillance, searching for hostile surface ships, as well as transfer supplies, ammunition, letters, and men to other task force ships and ashore as the Milk Run. They evacuated casualties and operated search and rescue. His best-known role, however, was to act as a decoy for Exocet missiles, considered state-of-the-art, able to fly at very low levels to evade radar. They were to prove deadly to HMS Sheffield, killing 20 servicemen, HMS Glamorgan, where 14 perished, and the Merchant Navy's Atlantic Conveyor, in an attack that killed 12 and destroyed the helicopters intended to carry troops across the islands. Lacking weapons that were sufficiently fast-firing to tackle the incoming sea-skimming missiles at short range, the Navy adopted a novel solution. Helicopters were deployed to drop chaff, strips of metal, that confused the radar seeking of an incoming missile into thinking the metal was another target. Ships also fired chaff C shells, C for confusion, from their 4.5-inch guns. The helicopter could hover in the vicinity of the aircraft carrier to distract and lure the Exocet missile away, a risk compounded by the British Seawolf defense missiles in the accompanying Type 22 frigate, known as the Goalkeeper, sometimes locking on to the Sea King itself. The prince later remembered almost being killed by a chaff shell fired from a British warship. By chance in our general direction, and for a moment it was on a steady bearing, which meant it was going to hit us. Thankfully it passed in front of the helicopter, but I don't know how far, but rather further than I had imagined it to have been. It was skilled and dangerous work, for even everyday duties such as transporting goods and people had their risks, given the atrocious weather conditions and the fact that for over 60% of its time the Sea King operated in the dark. The demanding rotas saw the squadron flying around the clock continuously for weeks on end, 4 hours in the air and 6 or 7 hours back on board, as a small group of choppers were sent out on their various duties in a non-stop cycle of eating, sleeping, flying, blurring the line between night and day. Tom Arnold, who served as a wingman and part of the four-man team with Andrew, alongside senior pilot Chris Heweth and Ian McAllister as observer, remembered them living off tinned meat and vegetables and sometimes being so tired they'd fall asleep in the air. He found Andrew willing to muck in. If we were in a rush, he'd help me load the chopper, and as a rookie sub-lieutenant prepared to take advice, although the prince was a bit awkward since he had little understanding of their lives and remained very private. Deputy Air Engineering Officer Steve George, responsible for the upkeep of the aircraft, thought Andrew a competent P2. The Duke's divisional duties included being mess deck officer, and George remembered the prince using his royal status to try and ensure the fleet air arm received the best accommodations on ship. Like others before him, he felt Andrew was a shy person trying to compensate. The prince was a good pilot and officer in good company, but also found the squadron uncongenial. One of the helicopter pilots who served with Andrew in the Falcons was more critical, judging him self-important, self-opinionated, arrogant, and contemptuous. After the war, there would be claims that the second in line to the throne was never put in danger and that his bravery had been exaggerated for propaganda reasons. But this is disputed by Wyke Snade. Outside my squadron, apart from my captain Jeremy Black, nobody had any influence over the employment of PA during hostilities. Admitting that he and Black had developed codes that could be used to avoid calling on the prince if another aircraft was immediately available to take a high-risk task at no notice, Wyke Snade added that protecting the aircraft carrier was far more important than saving a prince and a helicopter. They were as much about covering our backsides in the inevitable official inquiry into the loss of the spare to the throne as anything else. Yet with Andrew remaining aboard the carrier, there was of course little chance that he could be captured and paraded through the streets of Buenos Aires, as the enemy intended. Wyke Snade knew that ashore the risk would be higher, but found no reason to include Andrew in the detachment sent to San Carlos on operations west of the Falkland Islands themselves. He denied that Andrew wasn't allowed ashore during hostilities. Rather, he said there was no requirement for him to go ashore since his duties were with the carrier battle group. Andrew has since spoken of his terror after flying over the Atlantic conveyor, where he rescued 8 crew. I saw it being struck by the missile, and it was something I'll never forget. It was horrific. Wyke Snade felt that such comments went against a soldier's professional ethos. Nevertheless, on a number of occasions, inevitably, Andrew was exposed to significant risk and danger. Luckily for him, Black and Wyke Snade had survived them. I have no doubt that at the time he, like most of us, wondered whether he would. On June 14th, the Argentines surrendered, and 3 days later Andrew flew to Stanley with Wyke Snade and the commanding officer of the Sea Harrier Squadron, Sharkey Ward. He was able to fly around some of the islands, joke about bringing his bride on a honeymoon, and telephone his mother. The line was so clear it was like speaking to London from Edinburgh, he recalled. My mother was in. It was about the right time of evening. She was quite surprised to hear from me. The Navy were keen to exploit their pin-up royal hero, and over the next few days the prince gave a series of newspaper interviews. On August 23rd, the Sun produced a special issue on Andrew, the royal helicopter hero. He went away a royal rascal, Randy Andy, the Queen's likable but lightweight son, the paper trilled. But 4 months with the task force has made a man of the Playboy Prince. Few of Invincible's 1,000-strong crew had been very impressed with Andrew when he joined the task force. At first the prince seemed more like a 14-year-old than a 22. He seemed to have led a very sheltered life, said a shipmate. He would sit clapping TV shows like the Muppets, and he loved playing foolish pranks. But views soon changed, as another shipman explained. I think going to war gave him a tremendous jolt. He flew over the Sheffield as it sank and helped rescue the survivors from the Atlantic conveyor. That sort of experience makes anyone grow up quickly. When the chips were down and the going got rough, Andrew proved to be as brave as the next man. On September 17th, Invisible, continuously at sea for a record 166 days, arrived back in Britain surrounded by pleasure cruisers filled with bare-breasted women, a traditional welcome for task force ships. Andrew's parents and sister, who had joined the ship, were reunited with him in a private stateroom before it sailed into Portsmouth as the Royal Marines Band played Land of Hope and Glory and Those Magnificent Men in Their Flying Machines. The prince later admitted of his Falkland service, "I'm not sure if it made me a better person, but those experiences undoubtedly made me view life with more compassion and a greater understanding of humanity. I can certainly say that I wouldn't be the person I am today without the experience." In a defining image, the grinning young naval officer disembarked the ship with a red rose presented by a young girl, clenched between his teeth. The good-looking son of the sovereign had done his duty bravely, and had never been more popular. HRH was now said to stand for His Royal Heartthrob. Okay, well, he's off flying helicopters, becoming a man, growing up from the seeming 14-year-old into what he truly is a 22-year-old. But what of his love life? Okay, so enter one of the more famous of his girlfriend. This chapter is entitled Starkers. Shortly before going to the Falklands, Andrew, who had been dating a ballet dancer, Christina Parker, had met a young dark-haired actress, Catherine Koo Stark. She was 4 years older than him, the daughter of Wilbur Stark, a successful Hollywood producer, and Kathleen Norris Stark Caruso, an American writer and television presenter. After finishing school, Stark had embarked on an acting career with an uncredited role as a bridesmaid in the Rocky Horror Picture Show, and a part later cut in Star Wars. When Stark met Andrew on a blind date fixed by his Gordonston friend Charlie Young at the beginning of 1982, she had a small part in a production of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf at the National Theatre, and was living in a flat share in Belgravia's Chester Square. The dinner date was a great success, and he invited her to come to BP tomorrow for lunch, though she later revealed, "Initially I wondered why he was taking me to a petrol station," not realizing BP stood for Buckingham Palace. I bet she knew what he meant, but of course, it's funnier to say she thought he was going to take her to a gas station. They had lunch on trays in his apartment at Buckingham Palace. They were both single, carefree, and for Stark it started immediately. When Andrew comes into your life, there's no room for anyone else. He takes up all the space. He walked into my life and that was it. He was my life. There was no discussion. None was needed. Suddenly, I was his girlfriend. Using the code name Fiona Campbell, she would stay with Andrew at friends of his, or have evenings in at Buckingham Palace with Koo's cockatoo, Candy. In a short space of time, the relationship matured and grounded him. No more food fights covering footmen and mashed potato. Driven by a strong emotional bond and shared interests, not least in photography. A Buckingham Palace servant remembered the feeling among the staff, who all thought the world of Koo for her politeness and for treating them as human beings, unlike what was to come. The relationship continued through to April when Andrew left for the Falklands. He gave her a copy of Rudyard Kipling's poems as a memento, and they corresponded during the conflict. She was waiting for him at Buckingham Palace when he returned in September, and joined him soon after at Balmoral for, in her words, evenings spent playing parlor games, doing jigsaws, and pretending the dog hasn't farted. What a riveting life of enchantment. She had brought with her a pair of pink plastic cowboy boots, which did not pass muster with the chatelaine. When the Queen got to the back door, she stopped in her tracks, pointed majestically at a pair of fluorescent boots, and demanded, "Whose are those?" They were quickly replaced by some green wellies from Bolitar. The following month, the couple flew under the alias of Mr. and Mrs. Cambridge for a holiday at Princess Margaret's house in Mystique, where they were joined by her mother, the publisher John Hart, and a friend writer of Andrew's, Jocelyn Gray, but the holiday was brief. By chance a journalist had been on the same British Airways flight, and the couple were soon under siege. Stark likened it to being under house arrest. They couldn't go anywhere without a military level of preparation. The paparazzi were flying over low in light aircraft or swimming up to the beach in scuba gear, she said. There was a palpable sense of real physical danger. We didn't know if the people were coming at us were carrying a gun or a camera. 2 photographers were arrested in the grounds of the villa and locked up in the island's only cell, a bare room next to the local church, where they were entertained by a temperance sect singing gospel songs. It was clear this was a serious relationship. According to Koo's mother, they talked about spending the rest of their lives together. I thought they were going to get married. Returning to London, the two continued to meet secretly, aided by friends, such as the singer Steve Strange, who was then going out with Francesca Chessie Thyssen, daughter of the German steel tycoon Baron Heine Thyssen, one of the richest men in the world. They let the new couple rendezvous at their house on Seymour Walk in Chelsea. Andrew would call to let us know that he was on his way, said Strange, but he would never use his own name. The signal would be something like, "It's the changing of the guard." One weekend, the couple stayed at the Baron's mansion. Andrew, much to his embarrassment, smuggled out of Seymour Walk on the floor of a transit van, shocked Strange by his behavior, coming down to breakfast and making jokes about what he and Koo had been doing the previous night. "He told us he'd banged his head on their four-poster bed while having sex," recalled Strange. He thought this was hilarious. It was real schoolboy humor. Stark bought Andrew his first pair of denim jeans, while he gave her a t-shirt emblazoned with "Here Comes Trouble." It was to prove prophetic. The story of the prince's affair with the actress was catnip to the press. Her letters to him and a home movie of the two lovers were stolen from her flat. A 20-year-old palace kitchen worker, Kiernan Kenny, sold a story to the Sun. Queen Koo's romps at the palace, suggesting Stark stayed overnight at the palace so often that it had become a second home to her, and occasioning the Queen to seek an injunction preventing the paper from publishing its second installment, How Barefoot Di Buttered My Toast. Andrew tried to persuade the Queen's press secretary, Michael Shea, to release a statement asking for the couple to be given privacy, but Shea refused on the grounds that the palace did not comment on private matters. In revenge, Stark sent Shea an enema kit. He thanked her for her thoughtful gift. The press soon discovered that Stark had appeared nude in several dramas. A 1975 television play, The Blue Film, based on a Graham Greene story, with a script written by John Mortimer. The 1975 film The Adolescents with Anthony Andrews, in which she became the target for a trio of men who take illicit photographs of young girls. The 1977 films Cruel Passion, sometimes called Justine, based on the life of the Marquis de Sade, and Emily, which featured her full frontal and in a lesbian shower scene. She had also posed nude for several photographers. She quickly acquired the nickname Starkers. Questions were raised in the press in Buckingham Palace about Koo's suitability as a royal bride. As Prince Philip was supposed to have told Prince Harry, "One steps out with actresses, one doesn't marry them." The two lovers carried on seeing each other clandestinely, but she felt let down that Andrew accepted the situation instead of fighting for her. She escaped the attention by going on a trip to Australia, Bali, and India, though when she returned to London and saw him again, by then it was basically over. It wasn't like a Hollywood movie with a grand finale. In the end, we just ran out of energy. It had been strangled to death. All right. That's where we're going to end today. But tomorrow we're going to finish this section entitled Early Life, and then we get into a section called Married Life. So that's what we have to look forward to. But you guys, I find this all very interesting. Now, I know that as we read, we're going to find out all sorts of things that make us really angry with Andrew, but I do want us to remember right now that there is compassion that can be felt for him. I feel compassionate towards him because I feel like this was a really shy person who hadn't really been taught how to have social skills with other people, and who, by the very nature of who he was in life, had a really difficult time breaching the gap between his life experiences and the life experience of others. What has been consistently said to us is that he was sheltered. And he does seem like he was exceedingly immature, and he does seem like he has a real schoolboy sense of humor about him. I'm sure there was lots of things that would be off-putting about him if you knew him in real life, but since we don't know him in real life and don't have to sit there being off-put by him, I would like us to sit for just a little while in the compassion we can feel for somebody who is extremely shy and has decided to use his royal title as sort of a veil to hide behind. I think that his bombastic personality was all just part of a cover for a deeply insecure, shy, sensitive person who wasn't quite sure how he was supposed to walk in the world. And I think that he was off-putting and annoying, but I think oftentimes we find insecurity repugnant because it's too familiar. I think all of us are annoyed by the insecurities and the coping mechanisms of others because while we might be unable to articulate why we dislike that in a person, our soul knows why we don't like it, and we see it as weakness. I don't want to see your weakness because it reminds me of my own. And so I think it's really easy to push people away like that because their human weakness is too reminiscent of our own. It's too familiar. And so we find it's easier to despise people than to feel compassion. There are going to be plenty of times throughout the rest of the book where we can decide to be disgusted, annoyed, and disgruntled about the choices that he will choose to make as a fully functioning adult. But right now, this is a person who is coming into adulthood with very few actual practical tools on how to be a competent adult. He might know how to do things physically. Probably the military is the best thing to happen to him. But he doesn't know how to have mature adult relationships that are breeding grounds for common good in both sides. He doesn't know how to do that, and I feel sorry for him. So I personally need to fixate on that because I know my tendency to immediately want to judge, and I know that it would be beneficial for me to sit for just a few minutes and just think, this is a human being. This is a person who, by the nature of his birth, was given a great many privileges, but also, by the nature of his birth, was kept from a great many shaping and molding experiences that most of us have that make us into people worth being around. It's very hard to become a person worth knowing when you don't really have any adversity, or if you do have adversity, you don't have anybody to show you how to use that adversity to build your character in positive ways. So we shall see what happens with Andrew. Part of the story we know, but you know what, you guys? There's a lot in this book that you don't know, and it is riveting. Thanks so much for hanging out with me. I will see you again tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. Bye.